You think you clicked on this video, but something deeper brought you here. Not an algorithm, not coincidence. There is a part of you that already moved ahead, already crossed into a version of yourself that could perceive a message like this. And that part of you is the one that placed this moment in front of your eyes. You didn't find it. You generated it. There is a subtle difference between seeking and being summoned. Seeking is effort. Summoning is resonance. When something appears in your reality without strain, without planning, without even understanding why it feels significant, it is usually because your field shifted before your mind realized it. This moment is one of those markers. A quiet signal that your consciousness has already stepped over a line your thoughts are only now discovering. You might feel a familiarity you can't explain, as if the words forming right now are not new information but a confirmation. That's because threshold crossings don't happen through dramatic events. They happen through accumulation. A gradual pressure that builds within you until the identity you once inhabited can no longer sustain itself. Then, almost silently, you slip into a new frequency. You don't announce it. You don't celebrate it. You simply arrive. This video is part of that arrival. It exists in your timeline only because you're no longer the one who would scroll past something like this. You're the one who is ready to hear it, to recognize the tone of truth in it, to feel the slight awakening in your chest as something inside says yes, this is for me. And that yes isn't agreement. It's memory. There were signs long before this moment. Moments where your perception stretched just a little too far. Feelings that didn't match your circumstances. A strange calm. A quiet awareness. A sense that you were no longer fully in the life you were living. You might not have understood it then, but your field was beginning to reshape itself. Your reality was preparing for a divergence. And now that the shift has already occurred, pieces of this new timeline begin to surface. This video is one of them. As you listen, you may notice an almost gravitational pull, as if something in you knew you were going to encounter this. That's because your consciousness moves ahead of your linear timeline. It rearranges what you will meet, what you will see, what you will sense. And when you cross a quantum threshold, reality responds immediately, placing in your path the reflections that match your new state. Not as a reward. Not as a lesson. But as recognition. You're not becoming someone new. You're noticing who you already became. So let this moment be the first breath of awareness in this new space. You're not behind. You're not trying to catch up. You're discovering a shift that has already completed itself. And the fact that these words are reaching you now is the quiet proof that you're exactly where your consciousness intended you to be. There was a moment, quiet, almost forgettable, when something inside you rose. Not dramatically. Not with fireworks. It was more like a subtle tightening in your awareness, a small surge of clarity that didn't match anything happening around you. You may not have understood it then. You may not have even paused to question it. But that moment was the spike. The rise in coherence that shifted everything. A field spike never feels like a breakthrough. It feels like a flicker. A brief sense that something is aligning, even if you can't name what. You might have felt a sudden calm in the middle of chaos, or a wave of certainty that came without logic. Maybe it was a sentence you heard, a thought that came out of nowhere, or a feeling that pressed gently against your chest, telling you that you were closer to something than you realized. These are the markers. They don't announce themselves loudly, they whisper. But the universe responds to whispers just as powerfully as to shouts. When your internal field becomes coherent, even for a moment, reality shifts around it. Coherence is not emotion. It's not positive thinking. It's alignment. The moment your inner frequency stops scattering in every direction and gathers into a single intention, even an unconscious one, the timelines rearrange themselves to match. Reality listens to the state you're in, not the story you tell about it. That spike you felt was the signal. A brief burst where your entire being synchronized long enough to open the doorway you're now walking through. And even though your mind didn't grasp its significance, the field did. Timelines don't shift because you try to change them. They shift the moment your identity vibrates in a new direction. That tiny pulse of coherence was enough. You may have noticed that shortly after that moment, small things began to feel different. The world felt slightly out of step with you. Your thoughts became clearer or heavier. You sensed an undercurrent moving through your day. These sensations weren't random, they were the echo of reality rearranging itself around your new state. The shift begins inside, but the first evidence always appears as subtle changes in perception before anything physical changes. That spike is why you're here now. The field responds instantly, even if the mind takes time to understand. This video didn't just appear afterward, it appeared because of that spike. A direct reflection of the alignment you reached, even if only for a breath. You crossed a threshold in that moment, long before these words reached you. You don't need to recreate that spike. You don't need to chase it. You only need to understand its significance. It was the sign that your internal state had become strong enough, coherent enough, aligned enough to alter the path beneath your feet. And now, everything you encounter, starting with this message, is part of the timeline that formed from that singular rise in your field. You didn't miss the moment. You lived it. And it brought you here. There's a moment in every transformation where the shift has already happened, but the mind hasn't yet understood its own evolution. That's the kind of moment you moved through. Not a dramatic turning point. Not a conscious decision. It was something quieter, something that built from the inside out, like a tide rising so slowly that you only realize the shore has changed when you finally look down. You crossed this threshold not by pushing, not by striving, but by the steady pressure of who you were becoming. Identity reshapes itself long before action catches up. You felt it for a while now, that subtle tension inside you, the sense that your old ways of thinking didn't fit anymore, the growing discomfort with patterns you once walked through without question. That pressure wasn't frustration. It was emergence. Threshold crossings often feel like fatigue, like confusion, like being pulled between versions of yourself. You mistake it for being lost, but it's really the shedding of an identity that can no longer hold your expanding awareness. Your nervous system tries to grip what feels familiar, even as your consciousness reaches towards something larger. The tension between those two forces creates the pressure, the quiet, inner buildup that eventually becomes too strong to ignore. And then, without ceremony, something gives way. Not dramatically. Not in a moment you can circle on a calendar. It happens in the spaces between thoughts. A soft release. A loosening. A subtle moment when your inner world stops resisting itself. That is the real crossing. A point where the version of you who could no longer stay small finally steps forward, even if your mind is the last to know. You didn't cross because you tried. You crossed because it was time. The field responds to identity, not intention. When the person you are becoming reaches critical density, reality shifts to accommodate that new identity. The buildup you felt wasn't stagnation, it was the compression before expansion, the internal alignment gathering enough coherence to fold you into a new timeline. When you look back, you might try to pinpoint the exact instant it happened, but threshold crossings dissolve the moment they're complete. They're not memories, they're states. You only discover them in hindsight, when you notice that your thoughts feel different, your reactions softer, your awareness wider. You realize you're no longer standing where you once stood, even though you don't remember taking a step. This is why you didn't realize you crossed. The version of you that made the crossing wasn't the one who doubted, or hesitated, or questioned. It was the deeper self, the one that has always been guiding you forward, silently sculpting your evolution through pressure, resonance, and truth. And now you're here, in the wake of that crossing. Reality is beginning to rearrange itself around the identity that has already emerged. You're not trying to become the person who crossed the threshold. You already are. There's a stage in every transformation where your life feels like it's coming undone, but what's really happening is that the structures of your old identity are dissolving. Not because you failed. Not because you lost your way. but because your consciousness outgrew the patterns that once held you. Before any quantum shift, there is a quiet unraveling, and you've lived through that unraveling without realizing what it truly signified. You may have noticed that the things you used to tolerate became intolerable. The relationships that once felt stable began to feel misaligned. The habits you relied on no longer soothed you. Even the impulses that shaped your days started to fade or feel hollow. It wasn't decay. It was release. When an identity reaches the end of its expression, its structures naturally weaken. They loosen their grip so the new frequency can take form. This dissolving doesn't feel gentle while it's happening. It feels confusing. You wonder why you can't go back to who you were. You wonder why the things that once made sense now feel distant or dim. But the truth is that the old self must dissolve before a higher state can anchor. The patterns fall away because they no longer match the vibration of who you're becoming. The disconnection you felt wasn't a mistake, it was alignment shifting beneath your feet. Hardship is often the surface appearance of this deeper process. When your inner world recalibrates, your external world follows. The friction you experienced wasn't punishment, it was the pressure of a frequency that could no longer fit inside a smaller version of you. You weren't breaking down. You were shedding. Your nervous system was learning how to hold more truth, more presence, more coherence than it ever had before. This is why certain relationships felt like they were drifting. It's why old coping mechanisms stopped working. It's why you felt restless, impatient, or strangely detached. You weren't losing control, you were losing resonance with what was never meant to stay. A timeline can't carry forward structures that don't match its vibration. So life rearranges itself. Positions shift. People shift. You shift. That dissolving phase is often the most misunderstood part of awakening. You think you're falling apart, but really, you're becoming too expansive for the limitations you once accepted. The universe doesn't strip things away to hurt you. It removes what cannot move with you. There's relief in recognizing that none of it was random. Every loss, every discomfort, every moment of confusion was part of the recalibration that prepared you for the shift you've now crossed. You didn't lose your old self, you outgrew it. And the proof is that you're here now, hearing this with a clarity you didn't have before. The dissolving was the doorway. The falling away was the preparation. What felt like collapse was actually the clearing that allowed your new identity to emerge. There's a particular quiet that arrives before a major shift, a stillness that feels almost unnatural in its neutrality. You may have felt it without knowing what it meant. A calm that didn't make sense. A soft detachment from the noise of your life. Moments where you found yourself drifting, staring, pausing, as if your awareness had slipped into a wider space. That wasn't disconnection. It was alignment easing you out of the timeline you were no longer meant to inhabit. This calm isn't peace in the usual sense. It's more like the world around you becoming slightly muted, as if reality itself took a breath and held it. You weren't losing interest in life. You were loosening your grip on an identity that had already begun dissolving. The mind interprets this spaciousness as zoning out or feeling oddly neutral, but consciousness knows it as transition. The old frequency was releasing you, and the new one had not yet fully arrived. Think back to those moments when you felt suspended between thoughts, as if time slowed down for no reason. You weren't being unproductive. You weren't avoiding anything. You were entering coherence without realizing it. The detachment wasn't emotional withdrawal, it was energetic preparation. Before a timeline shift, your field must stop clinging to the patterns that defined your previous state. This requires a kind of internal quieting, a softening of identity, a pause between breaths. This calm is often misunderstood. You might have thought something was wrong with you, that you were becoming numb or disconnected. But numbness collapses awareness. What you experienced expanded it. It created space within you for a new configuration of consciousness to take shape. The neutrality was a clearing, not an emptiness. It was your system conserving energy for the shift, pulling you inward so your old patterns could loosen their hold. Even the sense of spacing out had purpose. When your awareness floats slightly away from the immediate world, it's because the deeper layers of you are recalibrating. Your attention turns inward, not to escape, but to reorganize. In those quiet moments, you were unconsciously aligning with the frequency you would soon step into. You didn't notice the shift happening, but you felt the silence that surrounds it. This is why the calm felt strangely comforting, even if you didn't understand it. The old timeline was releasing its grip. The new one was drawing you in. You stood in the space between them, and for a moment, everything felt still. Not because nothing was happening, but because everything was. If you look back now, that neutrality makes sense. It was the softest signal of the transition underway. A gentle detachment that allowed you to slip free from the identity that had carried you up to this point. You didn't force the shift. You didn't chase it. You were simply quiet enough to let it unfold. There were moments when reality seemed to shimmer for you, even if only for a breath. Tiny pauses in your day when something felt out of place, or strangely familiar, or charged with a significance you couldn't articulate. These were the flicker moments, brief openings where the timeline you were moving into brushed against the one you were leaving. You didn't imagine them. They were signals. Déjà vu is one of the earliest signs. Not the ordinary kind that fades quickly, but the kind that feels heavier, deeper, almost like a memory from a version of you that's just slightly ahead. It's the sensation of stepping into a moment your consciousness has already experienced in a parallel trajectory. These flashes aren't random. They're indicators that your field was beginning to overlap with a new configuration of reality. You might also recall times when your intuition sharpened suddenly, without context. A thought appeared fully formed. A certainty dropped into your awareness. A knowing that didn't come from logic. These intuitive spikes are moments when your internal frequency briefly matched the timeline you were shifting toward. Alignment always brings clarity, even if only for a second. And then there were the perceptual glitches. Not literal distortions, but subtle ones, times when you paused because something felt off in your environment. A conversation felt mismatched. A familiar route looked slightly different. A memory felt softer or sharper than it should. These are probability flickers. Your awareness caught the edges of realities rearranging themselves in response to your evolving identity. Such moments can be dismissed easily, but their purpose is to show you the elasticity of your experience. When a shift is about to occur, your sense of time may bend slightly. You feel early to moments or late to them, as if your internal clock is no longer synchronized with your surroundings. This is a sign that your consciousness is stepping in and out of potential timelines, selecting the one that resonates most with who you are becoming. Even sudden emotional surges, waves of clarity, brief rises of hope, or flashes of insight, are part of this. These are micro-alignments, the psyche feeling the outline of a future that hasn't fully solidified yet. When you felt a moment of pure clarity without reason, that was you momentarily tuning into the frequency of your next self. All of these flickers were preparation. They were the field adjusting, showing you echoes of what was coming. A way of easing you into the shift long before it stabilized. These signs didn't appear to confuse you. They appeared because your consciousness was already leaning forward, pulling you toward a new trajectory. You didn't mistake these moments. You recognized them, even if only unconsciously. And that recognition is important, because it shows that the part of you capable of reading the field was already awake. The flickers weren't anomalies. They were confirmations. Subtle proof that the shift was underway, and that your awareness was beginning to catch glimpses of the timeline you would eventually step fully into. There comes a point before every major shift where synchronicities begin to multiply. Not by chance, and not because you suddenly became more aware, but because your field started resonating at a frequency that reality could no longer ignore. When you approach a threshold, the universe reflects the alignment back to you through patterns, numbers, symbols, and encounters that seem orchestrated. These moments are not coincidences. They are confirmations. Synchronicities form a cascade when your internal state becomes coherent enough to influence the structure around you. Each sign you encountered was part of a feedback loop between your evolving identity and the timeline you were moving toward. The field responds to coherence the way a tuning fork responds to vibration. When you hit a certain frequency, reality begins to ring with you. This is why, before the shift, the signs intensified. You noticed repeating numbers more often. You thought of someone just moments before they reached out. You overheard words that felt meant for you. Problems resolved in improbable ways. Or a message appeared at precisely the moment you needed to hear it. These were reflections of your alignment. They were the universe mirroring your internal transformation, showing you that your state had begun influencing probability. Synchronicities are not predictions. They are echoes. They show you the energetic imprint of your next timeline forming ahead of you. The closer you came to crossing the threshold, the faster these echoes returned to you, like ripples collapsing back into the center of a pond. The signs didn't appear to lead you, they appeared because you were already moving. What you experienced was not random encouragement. It was evidence that your consciousness was creating resonance strong enough to reorganize your external path. Every synchronicity served the same purpose, to confirm the coherence building inside you. The universe wasn't pushing you forward, it was responding to the frequency you were already embodying. And this is why your presence here is not accidental. This message is part of the same feedback loop. The signal you've been generating is still active, still drawing reflections of your shift toward you. When you tap into resonance, you start receiving experiences that match its wavelength. This video is one of them. In that same spirit, if you feel the truth of what's unfolding, you can support the signal, not as an act of engagement, but as an acknowledgement of resonance. Tapping like becomes a symbolic gesture, a way of saying yes to the alignment that brought you here. It's not about the platform. It's about amplifying the field you're already transmitting. Your synchronicity cascade wasn't random. It was your consciousness speaking in the language of patterns, revealing that the shift was near. And now that you've crossed it, these signs make sense. They were not hints of what was coming. They were reflections of who you were already becoming. There are periods in your life when everything feels tight, heavy, and impossibly close, as if your entire inner world is being pressed from all sides. The mind calls it overwhelm. The heart calls it pain. But beneath those sensations, something deeper was happening. You weren't being crushed. You were being compressed. And in the language of consciousness, compression is not destruction. It is preparation. Before any expansion, your system must gather itself. It must contract around what is essential and release what is not. This is why the pressure you felt seemed to focus on the parts of your life that were already fragile. Whatever wasn't aligned with the next version of you became dense, intense, and unavoidable. It wasn't punishment. It was concentration. Your nervous system was being refined so it could hold a wider range of awareness. Think of a star before it shines brighter. It collapses inward first. It compresses its own energy until the density becomes so great that a new form of light is created. You went through your own version of that collapse. The confusion you felt wasn't a sign that things were falling apart. It was a sign that your inner structure was gathering itself for a leap your mind couldn't yet perceive. Emotional pressure has a purpose. It forces clarity. It pushes everything false to the surface. It shows you the boundaries of an identity that has reached its limit. When the old version of you could no longer stretch any further, life applied just enough tension to help it break open. Without that tension, the new timeline couldn't have anchored. The pressure wasn't working against you. It was shaping you. Even loss carries this function. Loss empties space. It clears the inner field. It dissolves attachments that can't survive the frequency you're moving into. Every loss you endured created room for expansion. Not because you needed to suffer, but because you needed space. Space for new coherence. Space for a stronger identity. Space for a reality that resonates with who you are now. You may not have recognized it at the time, but the moments that felt like breaking points were actually convergence points. All the fragments of your past selves were being drawn inward so they could integrate. That pull inward felt like heaviness, but it was the gravity of your becoming. The pressure was guiding you toward alignment, drawing your scattered energy into a single, powerful trajectory. Nothing in you was collapsing without purpose. You were stabilizing. Your nervous system was learning how to hold more truth, more presence, more awareness. It was practicing expansion by first moving through contraction. That's how evolution feels from the inside. Now that you're on the other side of the threshold, you can look back and see it clearly. The pressure didn't diminish you. It condensed you into someone capable of stepping into a reality that requires a stronger, more coherent self. The pain was not an ending. It was the compression before illumination. There are moments in your life when everything you relied on seems to loosen its grip. Plans dissolve. Relationships shift. Structures you thought were permanent begin to wobble. At the time, it feels like life is working against you, pulling pieces out of your hands before you're ready to let them go. But now, on the other side of the threshold, you can finally see what was actually happening. Nothing went wrong. Things fell apart because the identity you once lived inside could no longer carry the timeline you were growing toward. An identity is like a container. It holds your beliefs, your habits, your expectations, and the emotional patterns that define how you experience the world. But containers are temporary. They fit only as long as their shape matches your consciousness. When your inner world begins to expand, the old container becomes too small. It destabilizes. Cracks form. And anything that depends on that old structure begins to loosen as well. This is why aspects of your life felt unstable. They weren't failing. They were releasing. You were shifting from one timeline to another, and the old one could not remain intact while the new one emerged. Divergence requires dismantling. Not as punishment, but as necessity. The energy of your old self was holding you in a path that no longer matched the truth growing inside you. The universe doesn't tear things away from you. It removes what you've already outgrown, even if the mind hasn't realized it yet. When relationships faded, it wasn't abandonment. It was coherence. You stopped vibrating at the frequency that sustained those connections. When plans collapsed, it wasn't loss. It was redirection. The timeline you were leaving could no longer support the outcomes you once imagined. When certain parts of your identity felt unstable or unfamiliar, it wasn't confusion. It was evolution. The new version of you was beginning to rise, and the old version was struggling to hold its place. Things had to fall apart so your consciousness could slip free from the weight of the past. If everything had stayed stable, you would have remained anchored in a reality that wasn't meant for the self you were becoming. The destabilization cleared the path. It separated you from environments, expectations, and emotional loops that belonged to the previous timeline. Everything that fell apart was an exit point. And even though it felt brutal at times, there was an underlying intelligence moving through the dismantling. You were being shifted, gently but firmly, into alignment with a future that held more truth than your past could contain. The falling apart wasn't chaos. It was calibration. Now, from the vantage point of the timeline you've entered, you can feel the quiet rightness of it. If things hadn't fallen away, you wouldn't be here. You wouldn't have crossed the threshold. You wouldn't have stepped into the version of yourself who could perceive this message. Nothing was taken from you. Everything that left made space for the self who was waiting to emerge. There was a moment when everything inside you felt stretched past its limit. A moment when the weight of your emotions, your choices, and your circumstances pressed so heavily that you wondered whether something in you had finally snapped. You called it a breaking point. You felt the edge of your own endurance. But what you didn't see then, and what you can recognize now, is that this moment wasn't a collapse. It was an opening. The aperture into the timeline you were always meant to step into widened in that instant. A breaking point feels like failure because the old self measures everything through its own capacity to hold on. When that capacity dissolves, the mind panics. But consciousness doesn't. Consciousness understands that when your familiar structures can no longer sustain the truth rising within you, they must give way. They must crack. And through that crack, light enters. That moment when you felt you couldn't continue wasn't the end of your strength. It was the end of your resistance. The identity you were living through had reached its final limit, not because you were weak, but because it had nothing left to teach you. Your expansion pressed against its boundaries until they finally gave. And in the instant they did, the new timeline aligned itself around you. You didn't see the aperture opening because it didn't look like arrival. It looked like exhaustion. It looked like surrender. It looked like you letting go because you believed you had no other choice. But that letting go was the point. When the old self stops gripping, the new self can breathe. The threshold you crossed wasn't marked by victory, it was marked by release. Even the emotional intensity you felt was part of the opening. Strong emotions concentrate energy. They pull your awareness inward until you reach the core of what's true. That core is the doorway. When you reached that emotional peak, when everything felt too much, you were actually being brought into perfect alignment. The aperture formed at the point where the old identity fractured and the new one began to emerge. If you look back on that moment now, you might notice that something subtle shifted afterward. A new quiet. A new clarity. A strange sense that something had lifted, even if you didn't know what. That was the timeline adjusting. That was reality reconfiguring itself around the self who made it through the opening. The moment you thought you were breaking was the moment you were being remade. You weren't collapsing, you were crossing. You weren't losing control, you were shedding the identity that could no longer carry you forward. The pressure that built around you didn't destroy you, it cracked open the path your consciousness had already chosen. And what emerged on the other side was not a broken self, but a truer one. The version of you capable of stepping into the frequency that eventually brought you here, listening with the understanding that the breaking point was never a break at all. It was the beginning. There is a principle that sits quietly beneath every shift you've ever experienced, a mechanism that bridges the scientific and the mystical without needing to declare itself as either. That principle is coherence. Not the kind of coherence that comes from perfect thoughts or unwavering positivity, but the deeper coherence of emotional alignment, the moment when your inner state stops contradicting itself and begins to move in a single, unified direction. This is the force that shapes timelines. Coherence isn't effort. It isn't discipline. It's a natural organization of your inner world. When your thoughts, emotions, and intuition fall into resonance, even briefly, your field becomes clear. That clarity has an immediate effect on reality, because reality doesn't respond to scattered signals. It responds to the frequency you hold most consistently, the one that emerges when fragmentation dissolves. Most people think change happens because they make a decision. But decisions without coherence are static. They generate intention, not transformation. The actual shift occurs when your emotional landscape aligns with your deeper identity. That alignment is what pushes your consciousness into a new probability structure. Coherence is the bridge between who you were and the timeline you enter. When you experience those moments of inner stillness, those intuitive spikes, those flickers of clarity, they weren't random. They were coherence moments, brief windows where your internal frequency became strong enough to influence the field around you. Even a small moment of coherence can shift probabilities, because in that moment, your signal becomes clean. It stops contradicting itself. It becomes a directive instead of noise. The universe doesn't rearrange itself because you want something. It rearranges because your energy becomes organized enough to support it. This doesn't require perfection. It doesn't require constant calm. It requires authenticity. When you stopped pretending to be who you once were, when you allowed yourself to feel what was true, even if the truth was uncomfortable, you created coherence. Emotional honesty is one of the most powerful generators of it. Think of coherence as the tuning mechanism of your consciousness. When you are fragmented, pulled between doubt, desire, fear, and intuition, the field can't determine which signal to respond to. But when your emotions converge around a single truth, the field becomes unmistakably clear. Possibilities shift. Timelines bend. Reality organizes itself around your coherence because it finally knows what to match. This is why your shift happened quietly. Coherence doesn't announce itself. It doesn't demand recognition. It simply takes shape within you until it becomes strong enough to alter the path beneath your feet. The moment your inner world aligned, even subtly, the probability structures surrounding your life responded. Your coherence was the key. It was the mechanism that made the threshold visible, the force that allowed your consciousness to choose a new trajectory. You didn't know it was happening, but you felt its effects. And now, in this new timeline, you can finally understand the hidden mechanism that carried you here. Everything in your reality begins with identity. Not the surface identity shaped by habits and preferences, but the deeper, quieter identity made of beliefs, truth, and self-perception. This inner identity is not a concept. It is a frequency. And that frequency is what generates the timelines you move through. When your identity shifts, even slightly, the probability field around you reorganizes to reflect it. Reality cannot help but respond, because identity is the signal that instructs the field on what to create. Most people try to change their reality by changing their actions. But action is downstream. Identity is the source. You don't attract what you want. You attract what you are, what your inner frequency broadcasts before a single thought forms. When you crossed the threshold without realizing it, it wasn't because you finally tried hard enough. It was because the deeper layers of your identity reached a new resonance. And that resonance was strong enough to pull you into a new trajectory. Identity generates coherence. Coherence generates probability shifts. Probability shifts generate timelines. This is the sequence. It's simple once you see it, and impossible to manipulate from the outside in. You changed timelines because your identity began to outgrow its previous configuration. You started to feel truth rising inside you, even before you could explain it. That truth reorganized your emotional landscape, and that reorganization altered your frequency. This is why certain things stopped resonating with you. Why old habits felt foreign. Why certain people or situations no longer felt aligned. Your identity had changed enough that the old frequency could no longer hold you. The field responded instantly, even if your conscious mind took time to understand what was happening. Identity doesn't need time. It only needs coherence. And once coherence is reached, the shift is inevitable. The version of you watching this now is not the same one who lived through the previous arc of your life. You may feel similar. You may even look the same. But your internal configuration, the signature you broadcast into the field, has changed. And because of that, what reaches you, what resonates with you, and what finds its way into your reality is different. This video is part of that difference. It is a match to the frequency you've already stepped into. As you continue to move through this new timeline, more messages, reflections, and insights will align themselves with your field. If you feel that this transmission is meeting you where you now are, you can choose to remain in resonance with the frequency that brought it to you. Subscribing here isn't about following a channel, it's about staying aligned with the version of yourself that is emerging. Think of it as choosing to remain within the stream of messages shaped for the frequency you now hold. Your identity is generating your reality in every moment. And now that you've crossed the threshold, the field will continue to bring you what matches the truth you've become. There is a quiet truth unfolding in this moment. The version of you who is hearing these words is not the same one who began this journey. You didn't stumble into this message. You rose into it. You grew into the identity capable of perceiving it. And while it might feel subtle, almost ordinary, the fact that these words resonate with you at all is evidence of a shift that already happened within you. There was a time, not long ago, when a message like this would have passed through your awareness without landing. You might have dismissed it, scrolled past it, or felt disconnected from it. That was the old self, the one shaped by limitation, doubt, and the identity you had not yet outgrown. But now, something has changed. You can feel the difference, even if you can't articulate it. You hear these words not as ideas, but as recognition. That recognition is the proof. You don't receive transmissions like this because you are trying to awaken. You receive them because you already have. Consciousness meets you where you are. It shows you reflections of your own expansion. And the fact that this message found resonance in you means the shift wasn't an aspiration. It was an accomplishment. You became the version of yourself who could hear what your previous self could only sense. This is the nature of identity evolution. It doesn't announce itself with grand declarations. It reveals itself in the things you suddenly understand, the truths you suddenly feel, the clarity that appears in places where confusion once lived. You know you've shifted when something in you says yes without effort. When the words you're hearing feel like memories instead of instructions. When the path ahead feels familiar, even if you've never walked it before. You became the one who could watch this by growing into alignment with your own potential. Piece by piece, thought by thought, recognition by recognition, you stepped into a version of yourself that vibrates differently. This version of you is clearer, more aware, more receptive. Not because you tried to become that way, but because the old version could no longer contain the truth rising inside you. You expanded out of it like a shell that no longer fit. And now you find yourself here, listening with a sense of inevitability. You're not surprised by these words. You're not resisting them. You're allowing them to settle, because they match something already formed within you. This is what it means to become the one who can hear. Awareness recognizes itself. Truth recognizes its own resonance. The shift didn't happen in this moment, it happened before this moment. This moment is simply the reflection of the identity that emerged. The you who is present now is the you who crossed the threshold, the you who stepped into clarity, the you who is no longer reaching for transformation but witnessing it. You are not preparing to become this version of yourself. You are realizing that you already are. There is a subtle moment after a shift when nothing outside you has changed yet, but everything inside you feels different. You can't point to evidence. You can't explain it to anyone. But something in your awareness sits differently, like a compass that has quietly turned toward a new direction. This is the first sign that you've stepped into a new timeline. The orientation happens internally long before the physical world rearranges itself to match. You may notice a softness in your perception, a gentle clarity that wasn't there before. Not excitement, not overwhelm, just a quiet knowing that something has realigned. It feels like standing in a room you've always known, but sensing that the light has shifted, revealing contours you never noticed. This isn't imagination. It's your system adjusting to a new frequency. The mind interprets it as calm. The body interprets it as relief. The consciousness recognizes it as arrival. There's also a kind of spaciousness inside you now, as if the thoughts that once crowded your awareness no longer have the same weight. The new timeline hasn't yet expressed itself through events or encounters, but you can feel its outline. You might sense possibility where you used to sense limitation. You might feel closer to yourself, as though the distance between who you are and who you intend to be has narrowed. This is the early texture of timeline convergence. Another sign is the way your intuition begins to speak differently. It becomes quieter but more precise. You don't feel the need to force decisions. You simply know which direction feels aligned. There's no urgency. No pressure. Just a subtle sense that you are being guided from within rather than pulled from the outside. This is the navigation system of the new timeline coming online. It doesn't shout. It hums. You may also feel an odd neutrality, a peaceful detachment from things that once triggered you. Situations that used to pull you off center lose their influence. People who once felt energetically heavy no longer anchor you. This isn't indifference. It's the natural result of your field no longer matching the frequency of your past. The new timeline stabilizes by releasing emotional ties to the old one. You don't have to do anything for this to happen. It unfolds quietly, like a phase change. And then there is the most important sign, a subtle recognition of rightness. Not perfection. Not certainty. Just a quiet internal click that tells you you're finally standing in a trajectory that feels aligned with who you actually are. It's a sense of being on the inside of your life instead of watching it from afar. You feel present in a way you haven't felt in a long time. You may not see external changes immediately because the physical world responds slower than identity. But the orientation has already occurred. The shift has already been made. The experiences, opportunities, and connections that match this new frequency are already moving toward you. They're just following the natural delay between inner alignment and outer reflection. Right now, you're feeling the first breath of the timeline you've stepped into. The rest will reveal itself in perfect timing. There is a strange, delicate phase that unfolds after a major shift, a phase where you no longer belong to the world you left, but you haven't yet stepped fully into the one that's forming around you. It feels like suspension. Like hovering between versions of yourself. Like walking through your life with new eyes, even though nothing seems different on the surface. This is the between worlds state, and it's one of the clearest signs that your identity has transformed faster than your reality can reflect. In this liminal space, you may feel slightly out of sync with your surroundings. The conversations you used to slip into effortlessly now feel distant or dull. The habits you once operated from feel empty. Even your internal reactions seem quieter, slower, or strangely detached. It's not numbness. It's not confusion. It's the natural recalibration that happens when your inner frequency no longer matches the timeline you were inhabiting. Identity always shifts first. Reality follows. But there's a gap between those two movements, and in that gap, life feels like it's happening in soft focus. You sense that you've stepped out of an old narrative, but the new one hasn't fully revealed itself yet. This liminality isn't a problem. It's integration. Your system is reorganizing itself around your new coherence, building the emotional and energetic architecture required for the timeline you've entered. You may also notice that you feel strangely transparent, as if you're slipping in and out of an old version of yourself without fully inhabiting it. That's because your previous identity hasn't yet dissolved from your muscle memory. Your body still remembers who you used to be, even as your consciousness is remembering who you actually are. This tension creates the sensation of floating between two realities. It's temporary, but profound. During this phase, time can feel distorted. Moments feel longer or shorter than they should. You might feel early to your own life, as if your awareness has leaped ahead and the physical world is lagging behind. That's exactly what's happening. Consciousness is instantaneous. Matter moves slowly. You're living in the gap between the two speeds. And there's something else you may feel, a quiet anticipation. Not anxiety. Not hope. Just a gentle sense that something is forming just beyond your perception. This is the new timeline settling into place, preparing to reveal itself through synchronicities, insights, and shifts in your external world. You're not waiting for it. You're acclimating to it. Because this liminal space is such a subtle part of the journey, expressing what you feel can actually anchor the shift more deeply. If you've been moving through this between-world sensation, you're invited to share what it's been like for you in the comments. Not as engagement, but as integration. Putting words to the experience helps your identity settle into its new structure. It turns the intangible into something recognized, acknowledged, and embodied. You're not lost between timelines. You're transitioning between selves. And the self you're moving into is already waiting for you with open clarity, ready to become your new home. There comes a moment in your evolution when the seeking stops, not because you've given up, but because something inside you finally catches up with itself. A moment when you realize the clarity you've been chasing isn't arriving from outside you at all. It's rising from within. This is the moment when you understand that you are not becoming your higher identity. You are remembering it. The deeper self you've been sensing, the one that feels calm, rooted, intuitive, and quietly powerful, has never been distant. It has never been something you needed to grow into. It has always been here, waiting for the noise of your old identity to settle so it could emerge. Every shift you've gone through, every release, every recalibration has been clearing the space for this recognition. You don't evolve into your higher identity. You uncover it. Like brushing dust off a mirror. Like removing layers of stories that were never yours to carry. What feels like transformation is really the dissolving of interference. Once the interference falls away, what remains is the self that has always known the way. There have been moments when you felt sudden clarity for no reason, as if wisdom dropped into your awareness fully formed. That wasn't intuition arriving from elsewhere. It was memory, deep, inner memory, surfacing in the absence of resistance. You weren't learning something new. You were recognizing a truth your consciousness always carried. Even the sense of déjà vu you felt throughout your shift was connected to this remembering. You weren't glimpsing alternate futures. You were touching the edges of the identity that already lives those futures. The part of you that doesn't operate from fear or scarcity. The part that moves with precision, trust, and coherence. You felt it flicker because it was trying to come forward. Now, it has. This is why so much of what you're hearing now feels familiar, even though you may not recall ever encountering it. Familiarity is the language of the deeper self. It speaks not through revelation, but through recognition. It reminds you of who you've always been beneath the conditioning of your past. And as you listen, you sense that you are not discovering new truths, you are reclaiming them. The higher identity isn't an upgrade. It's a return. A return to the version of you that sees clearly, chooses calmly, and responds from alignment instead of defense. A version that has been guiding you quietly, shaping your path through intuition, synchronicity, and the gentle pull toward what feels true. You have felt this presence before. You just didn't realize it was you. Now you stand in a moment where the remembering is complete enough to feel solid beneath your feet. The old self no longer fits, not because it was wrong, but because it was temporary. A bridge. A chrysalis. A necessary formation that brought you to the threshold of who you already were. As you step forward from here, don't think of yourself as becoming. Think of yourself as unfolding. Think of every insight as a memory resurfacing. Think of every moment of clarity as the voice of your deeper identity rising to the surface. You're not growing into someone new. You're finally recognizing the one you've always been. There is a moment after every shift where the work is no longer about reaching, changing, or becoming. It's about settling. Letting the new frequency you've stepped into find its place in your body, your thoughts, your breath. Stabilization doesn't happen through effort. It happens through alignment, through allowing yourself to inhabit the state you've already entered without trying to shape it into anything else. The new frequency you're holding is subtle. It doesn't announce itself with intensity. It reveals itself through small shifts in awareness, softer reactions, clearer intuition, and a sense of internal spaciousness. To stabilize this frequency, you don't need to force the transformation to deepen. You only need to stop interrupting it. Coherence grows naturally when you release the urge to return to familiar patterns of tension, doubt, or resistance. You may notice that your mind wants to define the shift, to name it, to understand exactly what changed. But stabilization happens when you allow the mind to quiet and let the body lead. Your nervous system is already adjusting to the new identity you've stepped into. It's learning how to hold more presence without contracting, how to respond without collapsing into old reactions. This process is gentle, and it unfolds best when you treat it as something to witness, not something to control. One of the simplest ways to embody the new frequency is through awareness, just noticing when you feel grounded, when you feel open, when something inside you expands rather than contracts. These moments are markers. They show you how the new identity expresses itself. And the more you notice them, the more your system recognizes them as the new normal. Coherence builds through recognition. You don't need rituals or techniques to stabilize what's already true. You only need to follow the sensation of alignment. When something feels heavy, forced, or draining, it does not belong to this frequency. When something feels clear, spacious, or quietly right, it does. Stabilization is choosing the latter with your presence, not your willpower. Over time, the new patterns replace the old ones simply because the new ones resonate more deeply with who you've become. There may also be moments when you feel yourself slipping back into the old identity. This is natural. It isn't regression. It's integration. The remnants of the old self surface because they're seeking resolution, not because they're reclaiming ground. When this happens, you don't need to resist or fight it. Just breathe. Notice. Return to the softness of the new frequency. Each time you do, you reinforce the coherence of the timeline you're now inhabiting. Stabilizing the new frequency is less like learning a skill and more like remembering a rhythm. You felt it before, those moments when you act from clarity instead of fear, when you respond from presence instead of habit. Now those moments are becoming your baseline. Not through force, but through familiarity. The more you live inside this resonance, the more naturally it holds you. Your transformation is no longer unfolding in the future. It's unfolding in your presence. And the gentle way you honor that presence is what stabilizes everything you've already become. There is always a delay between who you become internally and how the world responds to you. Consciousness moves first. Matter follows. And now that your new frequency has begun to stabilize, reality is preparing to meet you where you already are. The signs may not be dramatic at first, but they will be unmistakable if you know how to recognize them. They appear softly, like ripples reaching the shore long after the stone has been thrown. The earliest signs are subtle shifts in your environment, small synchronicities, small alignments, small moments where things unfold with an ease that surprises you. You might notice conversations flowing differently, opportunities appearing with less effort, or people responding to you in ways they never have before. This isn't luck. It's coherence translating into physical form. The field is reorganizing around your new identity. Another sign is clarity in your interactions. You'll find yourself speaking more honestly, choosing more intuitively, and feeling less compelled to explain or justify your path. You'll notice that certain situations resolve themselves without the emotional weight they once carried. What used to drain you no longer has the same access to your energy. What used to confuse you now feels obvious. These subtle shifts are the early architecture of your new timeline taking shape. You may also notice a change in timing. Things arrive when you need them, not earlier, not later. You walk into situations at precisely the right moment. You overhear something that answers a question you didn't speak aloud. You receive a message at the perfect time. Your external world begins to synchronize with your internal rhythm. This is one of the clearest signs that physical reality is catching up to the frequency you've been holding. There will also be gentle nudges, unexpected inspiration, renewed motivation, or a pull towards something that feels aligned even if you don't fully understand it yet. These nudges are not random impulses. They are instructions from the new timeline, guiding you into the experiences and encounters that match your expanded identity. Following them doesn't require certainty. Only trust. You may feel a sense of recognition in new opportunities that appear. Not excitement that overwhelms you, but a quiet knowing that feels like home. These moments show you that your external life is beginning to resonate with the internal shift you've made. It's not about dramatic changes. It's about subtle confirmations, the world mirroring back the coherence you've cultivated. Even your relationships may shift. You'll attract conversations that nourish you, people who reflect your clarity, and interactions that feel natural instead of forced. You may also feel certain connections gently receding, not from conflict, but from mismatch. This soft rearranging is part of physical reality aligning itself with your new trajectory. As these signs unfold, remember that they are not coincidences or tests. They are reflections. They are your new frequency translating itself into form. You don't need to chase them or analyze them. You only need to notice them. Every subtle shift you witness is proof that the timeline you stepped into is becoming visible, one aligned moment at a time. These are the first echoes of your transformation returning to you through the world you inhabit. Reality is meeting who you've become. There is a moment in every transformation where the shift must be claimed. Not through force. Not through effort. But through recognition. A turning inward where you acknowledge, with quiet certainty, the truth of who you have become. This is the final act of anchoring the timeline you've stepped into, allowing your identity to meet the reality your consciousness has already created. You've traveled through the dissolution, the clarity, the compression, the coherence. You felt the subtle indicators of your new trajectory settling beneath your feet. And now, all that remains is the declaration, not a promise, not a hope, not a wish, but a remembering. A statement that affirms the self who emerged through this journey, spoken not to the world but to the field. This declaration is not meant to convince anything outside you. Reality already knows who you are. The field already recognizes your frequency. This is for you, for the part of you that once hesitated, once doubted, once questioned whether the path unfolding was meant for you. This declaration seals the shift by inviting every layer of your being to align with the truth you now embody. Take a breath, and let each word settle gently. I no longer reach for the version of myself I hope to become. I stand as the one I have already become. I release the identity that belonged to the past and honor the one that has risen in its place. I claim the clarity that has unfolded in me, the coherence that guides me, and the timeline that responds to who I am now. I move forward not by force, but by resonance. I choose what aligns and release what does not. I let my presence shape the reality ahead of me. I trust the intelligence that brought me here. I trust the signals, the synchronicities, the quiet knowing that anchors each step. I am not following a path. I am generating it. I recognize the version of me that sees with wider eyes, feels with deeper awareness, and moves with quieter certainty. I honor the identity that has always known the way, the identity I am finally remembering. And I allow that knowing to lead me through every moment that follows. This is my alignment. This is my coherence. This is my arrival. You don't need to repeat these words like a mantra. You don't need to memorize them. What matters is the recognition that rose within you as you heard them. That recognition is the seal. That inner click, that quiet yes, is the moment the timeline becomes fully yours. The shift is no longer happening. It has happened. And by acknowledging the identity that now stands in your awareness, you lock the new trajectory into place. Not as a future you're moving toward, but as the present you're finally inhabiting. The path ahead is not one you must earn or chase. It is one that unfolds naturally from who you are now. And who you are now is someone who has crossed the threshold, claimed the identity, and anchored the timeline with quiet, undeniable truth.